Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 289 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to take a look at some of the recent research about what makes for a high-performing team. Now, I think this could be really useful to understand some of these factors for all you thoughtful leaders out there, and I will put links to the research in the show notes page as we go along. But let's get into this episode right now. Now, there's been a lot of research over the decades and centuries over what makes a high-performing team. And thoughtful leaders, like any other type of leader, usually wants a high-performing team because it helps you, get things done. It helps you to work together functionally as a team. And generally, teams that work together well have a good culture. People have generally a sense of purpose and they want to come to work and do a good job. So that sounds like something all of us would like. So that's why in this episode, I want to cover some recent research I've come across that I think is useful to try to help us create those high-performing teams. And understanding the factors that make for the high-performing teams means we can start to take actions which hopefully build that high-performing team culture. And the first piece of research I'm looking at is from McKinsey. Now, McKinsey are a very prominent consulting company. Now, their research is not about consulting, though. It's about a lot of teams across various industries doing different types of work. And so it's not specific to the consulting industry. So there's a couple of things that McKinsey found out that were quite interesting and a few myths they've dispelled as well. There's a couple of myths here that sometimes we think these things, but actually they're not the reality. So the first one is that teams should ideally be stacked with top talent in every role to be the most effective. And the reality that McKinsey discovered was that, effective teams focus on the individual and collective skills and behaviors that matter, and every role needs fit-for-purpose talent, not necessarily the best talent, which is a relief, isn't it? Because the reality is, in any given city, there is only one person in that city who is the best at what they do. And so if you had to hire that person, you'd be in trouble. So instead of thinking, we need to get the best of the best in every role, you really just need fit-for-purpose talent is what they call it, which means that person has to be qualified and talented enough. And this speaks to the concept that a team of superstars does not really necessarily make a great team, and it can be counterproductive if they don't actually interact well together. Another myth that McKinsey has tried to dispel here is that teams already know what they need to work on, as in they're aware of their issues and where they need to improve. The reality they found is that teams are often unaware of their most important gaps and can have blind spots that are shared amongst the whole team, which leads them to prioritize the wrong things. So teams might believe that something is a strength when it's actually a weakness, or they may choose to work on things that they already do pretty well. So that's another myth here that's been dispelled. And the third myth that McKinsey tried to dispel here was, there's a best practice playbook for team effectiveness that every team should adopt. And the reality is that there's really no one-size-fits-all solution for every team. So the way they approached this research was to come up with a set of factors. So they've got different areas that they focused on, and then underneath each of these areas, they had what they called health drivers. And these drivers had a significant impact on team performance. So the 4 areas they spoke about in their research was configuration. So this is how the team is configured. Do we have the necessary mix of internal and external perspectives and role clarity, for example? The second area was alignment. Are we committed to the team and are we clear on our purpose and goals? Thirdly, they talked about execution. So how are we carrying out the day-to-day work of the team? And lastly, they talked about renewal, which is how do we create the right working environment for long-term learning and improvement, so having a sustainable team culture. So underneath there were 14 different factors or health drivers. So I'm not going to run through every single health driver here. I'm going to pick out the top 4. So they found that there were 4 of these health drivers that had the most impact on team performance. So I'm going to pick those ones out. Now, the first or the highest, most strong factor on team performance was trust. So they found that teams that scored above average on trust were 3.3 times more efficient than other teams and 5.1 times more likely to produce results. So trust is a huge factor. So that would be trust between team members and trust with the manager as well. So essentially, you need to build trust over time. And essentially, one of the ways I think is useful to build trust, which I'll cover in a future episode, is building connection. We can talk about that later. But trust is one of the biggest factors here. Another factor that was in the top 4 was communication. So teams that had excellent communication were 2.8 times more efficient, 2.7 times more likely to produce results, and 3.1 times more innovative. Now, if we look at the definition for communication here, they've said communicate sufficiently and effectively and choose the right communication methods. Okay. And when we go back to trust just briefly here, it's a feeling that people can rely on one another, give each other the space to get work done, and demonstrate good judgment. Now, the third health driver they found was quite effective was innovative thinking. So innovative thinking is not necessarily coming up with new ideas, but actually it was seeking out opposing perspectives, having open discussions about change, and encouraging out-of-the-box thinking and solutions. So it's more about different perspectives and open discussions about change. And that had huge impacts on performance as well, making teams more efficient, more likely to produce results, and more innovative. And the last one they found was decision-making. Now, decision-making meant that the team had clear roles in the decision-making process. They made quick, high-quality decisions and learned from poor decisions. So those are the 4 factors there, which are quite interesting. So before seeing this research, I was more of the opinion that things like goals and sense of purpose were the really strong factors that you needed in a team. And that's not to say that those factors are not important, but they didn't actually have the most degree of impact in how the team performed. So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of, sense of purpose and goals. I thought that, and commitment to that purpose, I used to think was a huge factor. And it is still a significant factor, but not quite as those 4 top ones, which were trust, communication, innovative thinking, and decision-making. So that's McKinsey's research, which I thought was quite interesting. Another piece of research that was done a little less recently, so McKinsey's research was published in 2024, and I'll put a link to the article that explains the research in the show notes as well, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/289, or you can also see it on the show notes summary in Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all your podcast app of choice. The second piece of research is from Google, and it's Project Aristotle, which has been around since 2014. They created the Project Aristotle to try to research, what makes an effective team at Google? And Aristotle's quote was, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." So that's why they called this project Project Aristotle. The research took place with teams across Google, so not just technology teams, but across all parts of Google as well. So they came up with 5 factors that were quite important when it comes to team effectiveness. And they found that, similar to McKinsey, they found that what really mattered was less about who is on the team and more about how the team worked together. So the most important factor they found 5 factors that were the most important. Number 1 was psychological safety. So, a strong team culture was correlated with each member's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk. So, when they say interpersonal risk, that's things like confiding in someone, maybe admitting they made a mistake, or maybe admitting they don't know something. So, that's an interpersonal risk because if I tell someone in my team, well, I'm not sure, I don't know how to do this, it's possible they could use it against me and tell people that I'm not good at my job or something like that. So that is why this is called an interpersonal risk. So psychological safety is super important. It's a number of different factors here. And in a team with high psychological safety, teammates feel safe to take risks around their team members and they feel confident that no one on the team will embarrass or punish them for admitting a mistake, asking a question, or maybe suggesting a new idea. Now, you can see the parallels here with McKinsey's research on trust. I see psychological safety is underpinned by that trust. And I think it's really interesting that both of these pieces of research had that as the underpinning factor. So psychological safety is the number one from Google's research. Now, number two was dependability. So on dependable teams, members reliably complete quality work on time, which is, the opposite of that would be, well, we're not doing the work on time, we're avoiding accountability or responsibility. So dependability is one of those ingredients that's actually part of trust as well. And so that once again underpins that McKinsey finding, which is trust is one of the big areas. The next factor, which is really important in Google's research, was structure and clarity. So what this meant for them was each individual in the team understands the job expectations, the process that they have to use to get work done, and the consequences of one's performance that are important for team effectiveness. So this speaks to the importance of goals, setting them at the individual or the group level, and they must be specific, challenging, and attainable. So basically, this is where goals and process come into it, and that's a really important factor according to Google research. The second last factor that they found important was meaning, and this is team members finding a sense of purpose in either the work itself or the output. And they found that was really important for team effectiveness. So in other words, the team members really enjoy the work or they have a sense of purpose from enjoying the work. They're intrinsically motivated to do interesting work and they think it's useful. And the output of their work is seen as important. So the meaning of work is personal and can obviously vary. And there's lots of different examples here. So for example, financial security is one way that people find meaning in work, supporting their family, helping the team succeed, or, creative expression within the team. Those things are all examples of meaning which are quite different. So each member in the team may have slightly different meaning, which is really useful because we can't expect everyone to come to work with the same perception of what work is or why it's important to them. And the final factor that Google found really important here was impact. And this one was termed as the result of the work of the team and the perception that your work is making a difference. So if you can see that your work is contributing to the organization's goals and maybe improving outcomes for the customer or other internal teams that you work with, then that is a really important factor. So it's interesting, we had McKinsey's research saying trust was a big factor, Google, psychological safety and dependability, which I see as big parts of trust or very high relation to trust as well. Structure and clarity was important. And in the McKinsey research, we had decision making, as in the process of how decisions are made, which is quite important. Then in Google's research, they found more emphasis on meaning and impact. So meaning that team members associate with their work and also the impact that the team's work has. So there's some similarities here. And you might be aware of a piece of research done in the 1960s by Tuckman and the stages of high-performing teams and essentially, or stages of team development it's called. And this was the forming, storming, norming, performing model. And essentially, this is a bit different and it's older research and people sort of have criticized that research for not being applicable in the same way to all teams. For example, teams might go through the process of forming to performing at different rates and in different ways. So I can see some of the parallels here, though, between all these pieces of research, even the older Tuckman model, in that if trust is a big factor, as McKinsey says, and psychological safety, as Google says, then you could see how a forming team is going to be the least effective because those levels of trust have not been built yet. And so there's a process, the forming, storming, norming, performing, that the team goes through to get to that performing state. And along the way, you're building trust at the same time. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to an article I wrote about the team development model a while back. So you can have a look at that if you're not sure about that model. And yeah, so just to reiterate those factors again, on the McKinsey side of things, we had trust as the number one. We had decision making as the number two. We had communication and innovative thinking as well. And so all those factors were important. And then with the Google ones, we had psychological safety, dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact. And I'll leave a link to all those in the show notes page as well. So I just wanted to call these out and raise your awareness of this research because I think it's quite important. And it asks the question of us, okay, how do we build trust? Now, building trust in teams is obviously an incremental process. And I want to talk about some of my ideas for that using a different model in the next podcast episode. So tune in for that one, and I'll talk about some of the ways I think we can build trust in teams. So thank you for listening today. I know this one's a bit of I'll call it a public service announcement about high-performing teams. I think it's useful to understand some of the latest research, even at a high level, just so you can be aware of those factors when you're thinking about how your team performs. So I'd love to hear what you think about this research. Is this what you have come across in your career, or is it a little bit different? You can leave a comment on your podcast app of choice or on the show notes page as well. That was thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/289. And of course, if you think you could use some help to try to create trust in your team or get closer to this high-performing team, I'd love to help you out. One-on-one or team coaching can be helpful for that. So please get in touch, and you can do that on my leadership coaching page. You can find out more about what I offer. I'm also starting to offer an introductory package for working with me for new clients only, which is just 3 coaching sessions. And it's a little bit of a lower commitment option for people that want to try coaching with me and, see how effective it can make your leadership. So if you're interested in that, go to that coaching page and hopefully we can tee up a conversation. Okay, thanks very much for listening once again. I'll be back next week to talk about some of the ways we might start to build trust in our teams to hopefully reach that high level of effectiveness. Okay, keep up the thoughtful leadership, and I'll see you, you'll hear me next week.